Hello, everyone. Welcome to class 13, the final class for level design and game architecture. So you'll be watching this in one of the last weeks of class or before one of the last weeks of class. Because classes get a little bit odd at the end of the semester sometimes, there may be a week where the final week where you don't have class, even though there are some classes that week. The final projects will be due to be submitted to me for final grading in that last week of classes, which may be after your presentations. So if you are taking a class that doesn't have a class in 2 weeks, then you will be presenting your project in class in your final class. However, you will have another week to revise it based on my feedback and possibly make updates before you turn it in the last week of classes. If you do have a class in that last week of classes, but don't have one in the week before, then just feel free to message me in Discord or via email and send me the link to your final presentation ahead of time, and I'll be happy to give you feedback on it so that you have a week to act on that feedback as students in the other situation would have. Want to make sure that it's fair for everyone. Let's go ahead and get started on this week's lessons. One more announcement. So we have trace evaluations that were available as of last Friday. If you have had constructive feedback to give and had any kind of issues with the class, I'm sure that you jumped right on that and have filled those out. And that's very much appreciated. I do want to make the course better. I value feedback, even if it isn't enthusiastically positive. That's really important. But if you did enjoy the class, then I want to encourage you to go and fill out the trace evaluation. Getting a balanced view of people who have issues with parts of the class and people who benefited from those parts helps me understand what I need to shift and change going forward to create a class that continues to work for everyone. If I only get critical or constructive feedback, then I end up changing the course and possibly removing or changing things that were working for other students. And I want to make it overall better. So please do give feedback, regardless of whether it's good or bad. Even if you just thought the class was okay, it's important to go into trace and fill that out. If we have 5% of our students filling out the coursework, we don't understand what the other 95% felt about the course. So please do go in and fill it out. When I tend to fill out these evaluations, I sort of assume or want to assume that, like a 3 is average. It was okay, it was a 3. And it turns out that's not the way that the numbers come out. Across the university, people tend to get 4.5, as a sort of normal review. So the scale isn't necessarily doesn't quite play out the way it is labeled on the slide or on the questions. So if you think the class was okay and you think it wouldn't change, then take that into account. Use what they say, rate it accurately, but understand that the numbers tend to, on average, skew higher than you would expect. If you had a real problem with something, please do mark it low so that that is strongly reflected in our numbers, and I know to make things better. If you think it was good or okay, then rate it appropriately highly. And I'll take that feedback into account going forward. I appreciate your hard work in making the class better for students in the future. So let's talk about sound, music, and rhythm in level design. So in the class, we'll discuss the reading, which will be Architectural Approach to Level Design, Chapter 13, talking about the role of rhythm in games and buildings. Lecture topics are going to be talking a little bit about social interaction and level design, which has been on my mind a bit lately. And again, also rhythm in games and buildings, and a little bit about level design and sound, how sound plays into level design. So in class activity, you're going to do your show and tell for your final project, and then you'll be doing a final which will be the analysis of another group's project. I had some students express some concern that, wait, there's a final? We didn't know about that. Is this going to ruin our grades? It's not. The final just counts as a normal exercise that you would do in class. It mainly allows me to assess your overall learning from the class and gives me one last chance to raise your grade. So if you're right on the edge, you've missed a couple assignments, you didn't get all the readings done, you haven't been able to make those up, and you really demonstrate that you have a broad understanding of the topics and that you're really able to break down and analyze another group's project, understand what techniques from the class they used, understand how they applied their patterns, then I'm going to see that and know that I have justification for raising your grade, that you really got a lot out of class. So it's just your benefit. Don't worry about it. I'm doing this to give you one last chance to impress me and to give me a reason to give you an even higher grade than you're already getting. So it's all good. All right. So social design, rhythm, and sound. What do we mean by social design in games? I just had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine who's worked on Guild Wars and worked for Google, worked for First Playable in Troy, New York for a while. One of the better game designers that I know. And he was looking at some social design jobs and having interesting discussions with the people interviewing him in terms of what exactly he was going to be hired for. What does social design mean? And I think that it exists on sort of three different levels at least, one of which directly relates to level design. In one sense, and his perspective going into sort of pursuing this was that social design is about designing social structures for multiplayer interaction in games. So if you're creating a game with guilds and large PvP interactions, then how do players associate with each other? What kind of structural mechanics are there in the game to allow players to form associations, allow those associations to have different formal relationships with each other, different internal structures? How do those internal structures relate to how players can interact with each other and interact with other social mechanisms in the game? Gift giving, base building, PvP, right? So all of those structural things are social design. But also social design can relate directly to low-level game mechanics in a game. Things like, what does the core gameplay loop do in terms of defining my interactions with another player? If I'm playing in a Holy Trinity MMO where I have healers and fighters and tanks, then those mechanics mean that I'm going to relate in a certain way to other players. If I'm playing the role of a healer, I'm going to have a certain kind of interaction that's going to color both my gameplay and my social interaction, how valued I am or not in a game. If I'm playing a tank, that is going to tend to move me towards a leadership role in the game because I'm going to be taking a lot of damage and maybe directing people as to what to do. If I'm doing DPS, then I'm going to be more active, but I'm also going to be taking a lot of direction from people. So that low-level design shifts the focus of the game. And that's true across all different kinds of games. I've talked a little bit about a game that I designed called Days End. That was a zombie live action role-playing game where all of the players were trapped in a single room, like 16 players. And I wanted them to have small-scale social interactions and to have a lot of distrust of other players, to form small groups and factions and to complicate each other's lives to prevent them from just solving the simple puzzle of the game and winning, and really to evoke a sense of fear and paranoia. In order to do that, I created a mechanic where many of the players had some reason that they had to give stickers to another player that they would put on their name badge. One player came into the game with a cough. And so if they talked to someone for more than a minute, they had to apply a green sticker to them. Another player had been bitten by a zombie before they got to the safe room. And if they got blood on anyone, then they had to apply a sticker. Another player thought they had been cursed and were unlucky, and so they needed to apply a sticker to anyone that they didn't like in the game. And the result of this was that as the game went forward, stickers multiplied on people's badges. I told the players, the stickers don't mean anything. They're just record keeping for me. Of course, the players assume that the stickers mean I'm going to turn into a zombie if I get too many, or I'm contagious if I get too many. And they became fearful of players who had a lot of stickers. The stickers also indicated that the players with lots of them had been doing lots of interacting with other players. The result of that and the fact that I laid out the space to facilitate groups of 2 or 3 players talking to each other. There were chairs set in small groups. There were sets of pillows on the ground. The bathroom, which was very small, was open. It was run in a hotel suite. It's been run in different places at different times, but that's the way I set up that space. And the result of that was that the type of social dynamic that I wanted formed based on the mechanics and the spatial layout. I didn't say each of you is the member of a 3-group faction and needs to act together, which would be that high-level top-down design. I built mechanics which caused players to fill in a high-level design based on their mechanical interaction. Then the third part of that, which I just alluded to, third part of social design is what kind of spaces do you create to facilitate social design? In my case, I laid out the physical space of the hotel suite, or I've run it at a conference center, different kinds of physical spaces, run it in a classroom before. And by breaking the spaces up physically into the spaces that facilitate the kind of social interaction I want, you tend to get that kind of social interaction. In a game, how do you facilitate social interaction based on level design, right? Do you create a place, say, at the beginning of a level where players spawning into it have a chance to socialize and plan before they set out on their gameplay? Anthem would be an example of that. Whenever you go into multiplayer, you start out on a ledge somewhere, you have a chance to interact socially and talk to the other players if you want, especially if you're playing in an intentional group, not just something pick up and go forward. If you're designing an MMO, how do you create the social hubs in that game, right? What causes players to want to interact in those spaces? And different games have done that with different degrees of success. It turns out you don't want to create the kind of spaces that would be social in the real world. You want to create places where players have a good reason to come and interact. The game Secret World does a good job creating a comforting central travel hub where you can get access to all of the things that you need and also move to the other spaces within the world for gameplay. But you have a place where you're going to run across all the other players and you can be social. Other games have done that less successfully when they try to recreate a real world city where everybody can go and interact. That doesn't tend to work very well because the players are then scattered over large geographical space and don't have the chance to encounter each other and interact socially. Multiple different social hubs spread across different levels doesn't work very well because it causes stratification in the player base between high and low level players, removes chances for that kind of interaction, makes it so that new players are less likely to be drafted into large groups to interact. A game that created that kind of space pretty successfully was one called Aeon. It's now a terrible mobile MMO, but at the time, their central city hub where you had a lot of interaction had a big central plaza and also gave players the ability to spawn player shops where their avatar would stand while they were AFK, and other players could come up and interact with that avatar like a vendor and buy things from their inventory that they had marked as for sale. So that central plaza became a bazaar where you would go and browse shops that you could find anything in. Like it could have super rare goods, it could have nothing useful, but it gave you a chance to go around and interact with all of these players who had suddenly turned into NPCs And also interact with other players looking for things. You would say into the general chat, hey, I'm looking for this kind of thing. And someone would say, oh yeah, go talk to that, that player vendor over there. They have the thing that you were looking for, and you could go over and find it. And that facilitated an interesting kind of social interaction. So when creating social spaces in game levels, think about how the players are going to be interacting with the game, not how that kind of social space would look in the real world, because players don't interact that way. Things like the chat system in the game are going to influence that. Is there only global chat? Is there only zone-based chat, right? Where so it doesn't matter where you are in the zone, but you can type into that chat channel. Is there local chat that is distance-based from where you are, so that players in the same area can say things and other players who are physically around them are going to hear? Those are going to create different kinds of social interaction within the spaces that you have. If you have only zone-wide chat, then having a central area where players can gather to talk to each other isn't going to be that effective, because there's no reason for them to go there to engage socially, right? They can just talk into the larger chat. That said, having only local chat is going to limit the amount the players can communicate with each other, and that will cause problems. This isn't a solved problem. Creating social spaces in games is very idiosyncratic to those games, and is something that a lot of developers struggle with. So there you go. Rhythm in games, rhythm in level design in general. So obviously there's games that are rhythm games. We've talked about how to create rhythm in terms of active gameplay and passive gameplay. And what does that look like in terms of level design? How do you want to create rhythm in your gameplay, right? And that can be something as simple as room, corridor, room, and so on, alternating repetition, shifting what kind of spaces you're engaging in gameplay in. And it doesn't necessarily mean encounter in a room and then a hallway, encounter in a room and then a hallway. It may be encounter in a room, different kind of encounter in a hallway, different kind of encounter in a room. Having those things repeated in alternating repetition kind of way will create that sense of rhythm. It doesn't have to be a just 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You can have more complicated rhythmic structures, but having those things repeat to some degree is going to allow players to feel that is a rhythm. Combat itself, obviously, within an encounter, there can be rhythm in terms of how you're interacting with NPCs. If you want to facilitate that, then you need to design the space to work that way, right? If you have the enemy's vulnerable to close combat, and then they push you, they're invulnerable, and they're going to be attacking at range, and you need to be very mobile, then you need to create a space that's going to allow the player to be close to the boss, but then also retreat to a distance and move in the way that you want. So to create that gameplay rhythm, you need to create a space that's going to facilitate that kind of design. That's something you need to be thinking about in each space you design for each kind of encounter you're having in the game. You can't just build the level logically and then put creatures into it, because that's not necessarily going to facilitate the way that the player needs to interact with them to create the kind of gameplay rhythms you want. So you have spatial rhythm and you have gameplay rhythm. They need to support each other. Lastly, sound design in levels. So sound design is really complicated, and it's its own kind of part of the field. For everything from having what is the score of the game? Is the score diegetic or non-diegetic, which is to say, going into a club in Cyberpunk 2077 and there being pounding techno music is diegetic. That's happening in the club, right? Walking down the street and hearing the music of the cars that are driving by, blasting their radios, is diegetic. Wandering over a rise in a deep enchanted forest with your, party of adventurers and having the music swell orchestrally, the kind of thing that you have a lot in say Skyrim, that's non-diegetic, right? That score is not actually happening within the game world. You probably want to have mostly non-diegetic score. It's hard to justify having music in the game without, very specific circumstances. Do you have a bard wandering around with you all the time in a fantasy game? Maybe in a cyberpunk game, you do have the choice to put on a radio that's just implanted in your brain and constantly, have appropriate music playing. Like that could be a cool element of gameplay, but you'd have to make that choice. Ambient sound design of levels. What is the space you're creating like, and what sounds should there be happening there? Having sound ambiently that reflects the kind of space that you're in is great and goes a long way towards selling the reality of that space. If you're in an enchanted forest, then having, tree frogs croaking and birds calling and bushes rustling, all of those kind of ambient sounds being played while you're moving through that space is an important part of designing the physicality of that space. It goes beyond that in terms of, what does your interface sound like, right? What does moving around in your bag sound like? What does accessing your inventory, accessing menus and so on? Do those things reflect the space that they're in? I've never really seen that very much in a game where, the sounds of you interacting in your inventory are different depending on what your environment is, but you could do that if you wanted to, and it might contribute to, to the feeling of the game. Are you cautiously and quietly shifting things around because you're in a dungeon? Is there ambient sound that's playing while you're doing that, right? Maybe the game world sound pauses, but depending on where you are still playing ambient sound in the background based on if you're in a dungeon or in the town or in a forest. So sound design can have UI reflections as well. And then, of course, larger sound design and levels. What is that score like, right? What is that sound design like? That's going to need to reflect the kind of level that you're in. You want a different set of sounds, even non-diegetic musical score, depending on whether you're in that forest or in that town. So that's going to be a sound designer creating all of that, but they need to know what kind of spaces they're creating it for. There's a lot of things that have been done with dynamic music in terms of having different musical themes for different kinds of enemies. And so as you're wandering through the wilderness, depending on what kind of things are around you, the music is going to be different and incorporate those themes. That can be really great and be a good cue to players, an affordance telling them what kind of situation they're in just based on what kind of music they're listening to. You mostly see that with like, oh, there's danger of combat, and so the music swells, and that's good. But I think we can do more in a lot of circumstances. So in dynamic things, tying music and tying sound effects to locations, you get that in the Silent Hill games where your radio starts crackling when there's monsters nearby. So you can do that kind of thing spatially. And then lastly, three-dimensional sound design. We have some capacity now to actually create sounds or physical spaces in a game in terms of the geometry and actually have that change the dynamics of the sound that's playing in the game. And so doing that and having a cathedral sound echoey, right, both in terms of player music and in terms of how the non-diegetic score is being modulated based on the space versus being in a forest or a different kind of physical space. So we're starting to be able to do that. That's harder, tends to be higher budget, but the tools are becoming available. It's something you may want to think about depending on the kind of spaces you're creating. All right, so that's pretty much it for the lecture part of class. Here's a little preview of the reading, what we're going to talk about. A lot of that is stuff that I just went over in the lecture as well. This will be expanded for class. And then for the show and tell, let me just talk a little bit about that so you can have time to start prepping what you want to do. Depending on how many people are in your group, we will cycle through, right? The first person would take over student 5 if there's only 4 people in your group. But the first student describe the game problem, design problem. Second student take over, describe each of the patterns that are being used in the problem. Third different student demo your game. Fourth student talk about what worked well with your game. fifth student talk about what didn't work or what was most difficult with your game production. And then I'll give chance for other people to comment within your group as well about the last two topics if you have something you want to add. So that's what we'll be doing for each final project presentation. And then the final exam exercise, which we'll do in the last part of class. And then you'll be able to continue working on your own, though it will be due by the time your final presentation of your final project is due, or the end of the week, whichever comes first for your class. Right, so final examination, exercise 31. So you're going to work individually on this, right? This is not a group project. And you're going to be assigned the project of another group. Each person in your group is going to be assigned one of the other different groups. You won't be working on the same ones. You're going to look at their design document, which they'll make available to you in class, and then you're going to compare it with what you saw in their demonstration. So does their design document reflect the things that they were talking about in terms of pattern, in terms of the level that they actually presented to you? And then in your readings and assignments document, you're going to list each pattern that the group used for their project. So that should be largely copying those names from their document. And then describe how well you think that that pattern was implemented in the actual level that they demonstrated. And then you're going to separately, so second part of the exercise, you're going to list as many techniques from the textbook or from lectures or other reading you've done as you can find within their design. So look at their overall design, list all of the techniques. Did they use prospect spaces? Did they use Zen views? Did they use, things that facilitated circulation within the game? As many different techniques, how did they use color? How did they use anything from this whole class? As many of those as you can find. And then for each of those techniques that you list, is it a part of a pattern, right? So if they did use, prospect spaces and one of their patterns was about prospect spaces, then you would, say prospect spaces, dash or whatever, the pattern name that they used to implement that. And how did they incorporate that pattern to create that, to use that technique? And then what techniques do you see in their game design that don't help solve their stated design problem, that are just there? So say, they do have, a lot of, narrow hallways that are confined spaces in the game. Like, okay, that's definitely something from the book, but none of their patterns really talk about that. It doesn't address their design problem. So list all of those techniques that aren't related. And then does that technique that they're using, does it support something else, some other part of their game, right? Is it needed to make something else work? If so, then note that. And if not, do you think that they could just remove that element from their design and still have their game be good? So that's what you'll be doing as your final. So be prepared to analyze the groups that you're assigned's work and answer these questions. And then there'll be a slide that will list who exactly you are going to be, who's working on whose group. And then your assignments for the rest of the class are going to be for the rest of your lives, are going to be to read the rest of the game design books that exist. There's an infinite number of them, so I imagine that will take you the rest of your life. For your final exam, you're going to review the final project and turn that in as I just described. And then your next step for your project is to go out and start designing games and to repeat that until you're ready to retire. And that is our class. So thank you very much for attending. I look forward to seeing your feedback and to looking at your final projects. So thank you very much.